Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the Winter War. It was a short, incredibly brutal conflict back in 1939, but one that had these massive, world-changing consequences. We're talking about a war that didn't just humiliate a superpower, it emboldened a dictator, and pretty much set the stage for the largest invasion in human history.
Okay, so let's get right into it. To really get the Winter War, you first have to put yourself in Joseph Stalin's shoes in 1939 and look at his biggest strategic nightmare. See, Leningrad, we're talking the cradle of the revolution, a huge industrial powerhouse, was just dangerously, ridiculously exposed. Its suburbs were basically within artillery range of the Finnish border. And Stalin was getting more and more convinced that Finland could be used as a springboard for an attack by Nazi Germany.
You know, this vulnerability wasn't just a concern. It became a total obsession for Stalin. He was absolutely determined to carve out a buffer zone to protect Leningrad. And to do that, he turned his sights on his small northern neighbor, Finland. And he came at them with a list of demands that, in his mind, were completely non-negotiable.
And this is where things just hit a brick wall. You can see how far apart they were. The Soviets wanted huge chunks of the Karelian Isthmus to shove the border back. They wanted a 30-year lease on the Hanko Peninsula for a naval base, and they wanted a bunch of strategic islands. But for the Finns, this was a terrifying prospect. They were afraid this was just step one towards losing their country entirely. So they made some counteroffers, agreeing to give up a little territory, but a foreign military base on their soil, that was an absolute red line. So, yeah, negotiations just fell apart.
So what happens when diplomacy fails? Well, if you're Stalin, you just cook up a reason for war. He needed what's called a casus belli, a justification, and it came in the form of the shelling of Manila. The official Soviet story was that Finnish artillery had fired on a border post, killing Red Army soldiers. The reality? We know now it was a total fabrication, a false flag attack carried out by the NKVD, Stalin's own secret police. It was the perfect excuse to invade.
And so on November 30th, 1939, the Red Army just swarmed across the border. And to say the Soviet leadership was confident, well, that's putting it mildly. The official plan was for this to be a quick, clean operation. They literally told their troops they'd be in a victory parade in Helsinki in a couple of weeks, tops.
And you can see why they were so cocky. I mean, just look at this mismatch. It is staggering. The Soviets had a huge advantage in soldiers, but when it came to equipment, it wasn't even a competition. Look at the tanks, over 2,500 Soviet tanks versus just 32 for the Finns. And aircraft, nearly 4,000 against a little over 100. I mean, on paper, this should have been over before it even started.
And this really tells you everything you need to know about their mindset. This wasn't just confidence, it was pure arrogance. The Red Army's biggest worry wasn't actually defeating the Finns. It was that they'd advanced so fast they might accidentally cross into Sweden. They truly believed Finnish resistance would just collapse in a matter of days.
But what actually happened out there on the frozen battlefields of Finland? Well, it turned into one of the great military humiliations of the 20th century. The supposedly mighty Red Army didn't just stumble, it completely fell apart. And a huge reason for this catastrophe actually started years earlier, right inside Stalin's own paranoid mind.
This number right here. This explains so much. During his Great Purge, Stalin systematically gutted his own military's command structure. We're talking over 36,000 officers, the ones with experience, the competent ones, the ones who could think for themselves. They were either executed or thrown in prison. And they were replaced by guys who were politically loyal, sure, but often totally incompetent. So the Red Army that invaded Finland was like a decapitated giant, and boy did it show.
So the Finns, massively outgunned and outnumbered, they did something brilliant. They turned the landscape itself into a weapon. They used this tactic called mati, which actually means a bundle of firewood. They'd let these huge road-bound Soviet columns drive deep into the forests. Then, their super-mobile ski troops would sweep in, cut them off, and chop the column up into smaller, isolated pockets, the matis. And once they were trapped, they could be wiped out one by one. It's a textbook case of asymmetrical warfare, right? A smaller, faster force using local knowledge to completely cancel out a bigger enemy's advantage. And if you want a perfect example of how devastating this was, look no farther than the Battle of Rade Road. For the Finns, it was a tactical masterpiece. For the Soviets, a total catastrophe. An entire division was just annihilated. And get this, the Finns captured so much equipment they could basically supply their own army with it. And in this moment of just perfect historical irony, they even captured the instruments for a Soviet military band. A band that had been brought along to play at the victory parade in Helsinki, a parade that, of course, never happened.
So how did this whole David and Goliath story end? Well, after those initial Finnish victories, Stalin was humiliated and absolutely furious, so he changed tactics completely. The Soviets basically ditched any idea of clever maneuvers and just went back to what they had plenty of: sheer numbers and brute force. They sacked the incompetent commanders and just poured in hundreds of thousands more troops for a new massive offensive. They unleashed these relentless, overwhelming artillery barrages that finally cracked the exhausted Finnish lines.
Now, the Soviet Union did technically win the war, but this chart shows you the absolutely devastating price they paid for it. For every single Finnish soldier killed, the Soviets lost 5. Think about that. It was a Pyrrhic victory in the truest sense of the word, and it exposed this shocking incompetence and a complete disregard for the lives of their own men. So in the end, Finland was forced to the negotiating table. And under the Moscow Peace Treaty, they had to give up even more land than Stalin had originally asked for. They lost about 9% of their entire territory, a huge, painful blow. But, and this is critical, they kept their independence. That's something the Baltic states just to their south couldn't do. It was a bitter, bitter price, but it saved the nation itself. So, the 105 days of fighting were over. Finland was still a sovereign nation, and the Soviet Union got its buffer zone. But the story absolutely does not end there. In fact, you could argue the biggest consequence of the Winter War was just getting started. Because over in Berlin, someone had been paying very close attention to the whole thing.
I mean, this war had been a public spectacle of Soviet military failure, and the whole world was watching. And that raised a huge question for the other major powers, especially for one man who was already planning his next big move on the European chessboard: Adolf Hitler.
The fallout from the Winter War was just devastating for the Soviet Union's reputation. It exposed the Red Army, for all its terrifying size, as a kind of paper tiger, poorly led, badly equipped, tactically clueless. It proved that Stalin's purges had completely hollowed it out. And for Hitler, who had always planned on invading the Soviet Union for Lebensraum, living space, this was a revelation. It convinced him the entire Soviet state was weak and rotten to the core.
And this infamous quote, this just perfectly captures the conclusion he came to. The Red Army's pathetic performance against tiny Finland directly fueled Hitler's belief that he could crush the Soviet Union in a few short months. The Winter War wasn't just some small border conflict. It was a catastrophic miscalculation by Stalin that basically gave Hitler the green light he was looking for to launch Operation Barbarossa in 1941.
Ultimately, the Winter War is just this powerful, chilling lesson in unintended consequences. It leaves us with a really fascinating, and frankly, a very scary question. Was Stalin's brutal victory in Finland the very thing that convinced Hitler he could destroy the Soviet Union? In trying to secure one border, did Stalin end up fatally exposing his entire country?